Sulle antiche mappe compilate dai geografi dei secoli passati si può trovare un enorme stato che occupava vastissimi territori dell'Eurasia. È indicato con il nome di Grande Tartaria. Tuttavia, se aprite qualsiasi manuale di storia moderno, non troverete nemmeno una menzione di questa civiltà, come se non fosse mai esistita. Sorge allora una domanda logica. Dove può essere scomparso senza lasciare traccia un impero così grande, più esteso di molti paesi odierni? La risposta potrebbe essere molto più inquietante di un semplice collasso politico o di una crisi economica. Esiste un'ipotesi audace secondo cui questa civiltà non sarebbe decaduta gradualmente, ma sarebbe stata quasi istantaneamente spazzata via dalla faccia della Terra a causa di una catastrofe tecnologica.
I ricercatori che cercano di ricostruire questo passato perduto propongono una versione secondo cui il territorio della Grande Tartaria sarebbe stato colpito da una serie di attacchi di potenza inimmaginabile. Si parla di impatti distruttivi paragonabili all'uso di moderne armi termonucleari. La cronologia di questi eventi tragici comprenderebbe il periodo dalla fine del XVIII secolo fino al 1816. Non si sarebbe trattato di una guerra convenzionale, ma di una totale operazione di annientamento, il cui obiettivo era la completa distruzione della popolazione, delle città e di tutte le infrastrutture di uno Stato un tempo prospero.
Důkazy této nemožné války leží doslova na povrchu. Stačí se pozorně podívat na geografii. Pokud se zadíváme na krajinu Čeljabinské oblasti a na nekonečné prostory Sibiře, můžeme si všimnout zvláštního vzorce, který je těžké vysvětlit přirozenými geologickými procesy. Rozsáhlá území jsou doslova poseta tisíci malých jezer s dokonale kruhovým tvarem. Zastánci teorie zničení Tartárie jsou přesvědčeni, že tato vodní tělesa nejsou ničím jiným než krátery vyplněnými vodou, vzniklými v místech detonací silných náloží. Hustota těchto kráterů naznačuje kobercové bombardování, které nedávalo žádnou šanci na přežití. To vysvětluje, proč se kdysi hustě osídlené země proměnily v řídce obydlené pustiny a proč byla paměť měst vymazána spolu s jejich ruinami. Než se ponoříme hlouběji do těchto důkazů a odhalíme kroniky zapomenuté katastrofy, přihlaste se k odběru našeho kanálu a podpořte tento materiál kliknutím na tlačítko Líbí se mi. Vaše aktivita pomáhá v obtížném úkolu obnovování pravdy, která byla po staletí skrývána před zraky veřejnosti. Přijetí teorie globálního konfliktu v tak nedávné minulosti nevyhnutelně vyvolává pochybnosti. Pokud se válka takového rozsahu skutečně odehrála před pouhými 200 lety, proč o ní oficiální historie mlčí? Kde jsou popisy velkých bitev a zkázy v kronikách, které známe? Ve skutečnosti stopy těchto událostí nikam nezmizely. Jsou přímo před našima očima, jen jsou vykládány zcela jinak. Mnohé podivnosti a nesrovnalosti v přijaté verzi dějin dávají smysl, pokud se na ně podíváme prismatem teorie vnější intervence. Jednou z nejzajímavějších záhad, která může posloužit jako klíč k pochopení toho, co se stalo, jsou události vlastenecké války roku 1812. Jsou nám vyprávěny příběhy o strategii a taktice velitelů, avšak některé epizody té doby, zejména slavný požár Moskvy, působí z hlediska tehdejší vojenské vědy zcela nelogicky. Právě v plamenech moskevského požáru se možná skrývá odpověď na otázku, kdo a jakou zbraní ve skutečnosti překreslil mapu světa na počátku 19. století.
It is generally accepted that the fire of Moscow in 1812 was either a strategic move by the Russian command or an act of vandalism by the French army. However, if we cast aside the usual school dogmas and analyze the behavior of the two great commanders of that era, their actions begin to seem devoid of any logic. Napoleon, a tactical genius, for some reason enters a huge, empty city expecting the keys to the Kremlin. as if not understanding that he has walked into a trap. The Russian army, in turn, abandons the ancient capital without a fight, which at that time was considered unheard of shame and a betrayal of national interests. There is a version that the true motives of this war lay on a completely different plane. Napoleon, perhaps, did not seek to conquer Russia, but to ally with it. His goal might have been a joint campaign of united forces to India to crush the power of the British Empire. However, a third force intervened in this grand geopolitical game. According to this hypothesis, it was British diplomacy, or more powerful structures standing behind it, that managed to convince Emperor Alexander I to turn Moscow into a grand trap. The city was not just abandoned, it was prepared for destruction. And we are not talking about banal arson with torches and hay. The nature of the destruction that befell Moscow makes one think about the use of technologies that officially should not have existed at the beginning of the 19th century. Stone buildings crumbled into dust, and the heat was such that metal melted, which is difficult to achieve with a normal fire of wooden structures. Particular attention is drawn to the memoirs of eyewitnesses who describe phenomena that do not fit into the picture of a normal fire at all. In the diaries of a French general who witnessed the death of the city, there is a record of a strange event that occurred on the very first night of the occupation. He woke up, not from the smell of burning, but from an unbearably bright light that flooded everything around. Looking out the window, the general saw not just flames, but a blinding sphere slowly descending right onto the roof of the Trubetskoy Palace. This description resembles a pinpoint strike by an unknown energy weapon or a guided munition more than an accidental ignition. The light was so intense that it eclipsed the moon and stars, and the subsequent blast wave and destruction left no trace of the majestic building. Supporters of alternative history believe that a tactical strike of huge power was inflicted on Moscow, comparable to modern low-yield nuclear tests. This explains why Napoleon's army, located in the city, began to rapidly lose combat capability, not only due to cold and hunger, but also due to strange diseases, the symptoms of which resembled radiation sickness, hair loss, ulcers, general weakness. The Grand Army, in essence, dissolved in the vastness of Russia, not in battles, but as a result of exposure to an invisible, damaging factor. Even Kutuzov's famous phrase before passing away, "I forgive you, but Russia will not forgive," in this context sounds like an admission of complicity in something terrible, in the sacrifice of the capital for higher but cruel goals. Alexander I subsequently received Finland, as if in compensation for the damage suffered, but the secret of the Moscow ashes remained buried under the ruins. If we assume that a weapon of mass destruction was indeed used in 1812, even locally, then the laws of physics are inexorable. The release of such a colossal amount of energy and ash into the atmosphere could not pass without a trace for the planet. The consequences of such a strike must have gone far beyond the borders of one country and affected the climate of the entire northern hemisphere. And indeed, historical chronicles around the world recorded a global anomaly that occurred almost immediately after these events, documentarily confirming that the catastrophe was planetary in nature. The events that unfolded at the beginning of the 19th century left an indelible mark not only in political chronicles, but also in the very atmosphere of our planet. The period from 1816 to 1818 went down in history as the year without a summer, although it would be more correct to call it a 3-year period of darkness and cold. In the Northern Hemisphere, including Europe and North America, the usual climatic cycle was disrupted in the most brutal way. Snow fell in mid-July, rivers froze, and birds fell dead from the sky. Crops died at the root, which led to the greatest famine, social riots, and mass migrations of the population. People panicked, looking for an explanation for what was happening, seeing it as the wrath of God or a harbinger of the end of the world. Official science offers a convenient and calming explanation. The culprit of global cooling is called the eruption of the Tambora volcano in Indonesia, which occurred in April 1815. It is believed that the release of volcanic ash into the stratosphere created a screen reflecting sunlight, which led to a drop in temperature. However, many independent researchers find this version untenable. The scale of the climatic anomaly, its duration, and intensity in the Northern Hemisphere correlate poorly with the power of one, albeit large, eruption in the equatorial zone. A volcanic winter usually lasts less time and has different distribution dynamics. Much more plausible and terrifying is the hypothesis of a nuclear winter of the 19th century. If we accept the version of the massive use of powerful weapons against Great Tartary, then the puzzle fits together perfectly. A series of monstrous explosions that destroyed cities and populations in vast territories of Siberia and the Far East inevitably must have raised millions of tons of dust, soot, and radioactive ash into the air. Burning forests, incinerated megacities, and evaporated rivers created a dense dome that covered the sun for several years. This is what caused summer to disappear. It was the global echo of the targeted destruction of an entire civilization, the Slav Aryans who inhabited the expanses of Tartary. The climatic catastrophe was a direct consequence of a war of annihilation, where the aggressor did not care about collateral damage to the rest of the world. Not only people died, but also a unique ecosystem. Relic forests that had grown for thousands of years disappeared. What we see today in the taiga is young growth, which is no more than 200 years old. It rose already on contaminated soil, plowed up by explosions, hiding under its roots the foundations of destroyed cities and the bones of millions of dead. The soot settled, the sky cleared, and survivors in other parts of the world gradually forgot the horror of the endless winter, attributing everything to the whims of nature. History was rewritten, memory erased, and the territory of the former empire turned into undeveloped lands that were allegedly always wild and deserted. However, no matter how carefully the traces are cleaned up, nature does not know how to lie as skillfully as humans. The atmosphere recovered, the climate returned to normal, but the Earth itself retained monstrous scars on its body that cannot be hidden. If you carefully study the physical map of Siberia and the Urals, casting aside habitual perceptions, a picture will appear before your eyes that cannot be explained by natural geological processes. We will see traces that speak more eloquently than any chronicles that something happened here that goes beyond the understanding of modern geography. Strange formations on the surface of the Earth, like fingerprints of a giant hand, point to places where real hell broke loose. If you carefully study the physical map of Russia, especially the territories of the Urals in western Siberia, you can discover a frightening pattern that official geography prefers to call features of local relief. We are talking about thousands of lakes scattered across the Chelyabinsk region and further east, deep into the continent. Their number is measured in tens of thousands, but the most amazing thing is not the number, but the shape. Most of these bodies of water have an almost perfect round shape, resembling saucers cut into the body of the planet by an unknown force. In nature, such geometric regularity is extremely rare. Natural lakes usually have indented shores, repeating the folds of the terrain. Here we see a picture more reminiscent of a lunar surface pitted with craters, which over time filled with groundwater. Proponents of the theory of the Great Tartary's demise argue that these lakes are nothing other than craters from powerful explosions. The density of their location in some areas is so high that it suggests carpet bombing designed to destroy all life in the area. If you overlay a map of these lakes on the supposed map of the settlement of the ancient civilization, the coincidences turn out to be ominous. The strikes were delivered to densely populated centers, industrial hubs, and transport arteries of that era. That is why today, these places represent sparsely populated wastelands, or zones where civilization began to revive quite recently, literally from a clean slate. Another undeniable proof of the global cleanup of the territory is the state of the Siberian taiga. Since childhood, we have been instilled with the image of an age-old, impenetrable thicket, where trees have stood for millennia. However, any forester or biologist will confirm a strange fact. In Siberia, relic forests older than 200 years are practically absent. If you compare these vast spaces with similar climatic zones in Canada or North America, the difference becomes obvious. In Canadian forests, you can find giant trees whose age counts 500, 800, and even 1,000 years. The Siberian taiga, despite its severity, looks like young undergrowth. Why, on a huge territory comparable in area to an entire continent, does the forest have approximately the same age, not exceeding 2 centuries? The answer suggests itself. The old relic forest was completely destroyed at the same time when the strange round lakes were formed. The taiga we see today grew on ashes, on scorched earth soaked in burning and death. This also explains the fact that at a certain depth in Siberian soils, layers with increased content of radioactive isotopes and traces of high-temperature exposure are still recorded. The earth in these places radiates, keeping the memory of the catastrophe that turned a blooming land into an icy desert. The radiation background in a number of remote areas of Siberia still exceeds natural indicators, and this cannot be attributed solely to industrial tests of the Soviet period. The traces lead to the beginning of the 19th century, when the surface of the Earth was subjected to thermal treatment of incredible power. It would seem that after such an apocalypse, it was impossible for anyone to survive. However, people remained on this scorched Earth, the indigenous peoples of the North and Siberia. Yakuts, Buryats, Evenks. They not only survived on the periphery of the catastrophe, but they also preserved the memory of those terrible days. But in their traditions and legends, you will not find mentions of enemy soldiers, cannons, or emperors. Their stories describe an enemy of a completely different order. What they pass from mouth to mouth makes blood run cold, for the culprits of the world's destruction in their epics are creatures that have nothing to do with the human race. If we turn to dry documentary evidence and not to modern edited textbooks, a completely different picture of Siberia's past opens up before us. One of the weightiest arguments in favor of the existence of a developed civilization on these lands is the works of Semyon Remezov, an outstanding cartographer and historian of the late 17th and early 18th centuries. His fundamental work, known as the Drawing Book of Siberia, is not just a set of schematic sketches, but a detailed atlas of a huge territory from the Urals to the borders with China. Studying these maps, compiled by a person who was personally responsible for land management, we encounter an inexplicable fact. Where endless swamps and deserted taiga stretch today, the master's hand has marked hundreds, if not thousands, of cities. The density of settlements on Remezov's maps is amazing. It was a densely populated country with developed infrastructure, many fortified points, and trade routes. The word China appears repeatedly on these drawings, and in the most unexpected places. But at that time, it did not mean a modern state, but a fortress wall or a fortified area. That is, all of Siberia was covered with a network of powerful defensive structures. Where did all these megacities of the past disappear to? Why is there only wind howling in the crowns of young trees in their place today? The answer to this question can be found in another work by Remezov, in the Kungur Chronicle, which he essentially saved for history. This document contains descriptions of events that will seem painfully familiar to a modern person if they have ever seen a chronicle of nuclear tests. In the Chronicle, specifically in Article 60, a frightening eyewitness account of the destruction of one such town is given. The text speaks of the appearance of a pillar of fire that rose to the very sky, connecting the earth and the clouds. This phenomenon was accompanied by a terrible roar and ringing that made the earth tremble. The description says that the city was engulfed by something like a dark cloud, and then destroyed by an unknown force that descended from the heavens. The ancient chronicler, having no terms like nuclear mushroom, shockwave, or electromagnetic pulse in his vocabulary, used images available to him: a pillar of fire, thunder, hail, and ringing. But the physics of the process is described with frightening accuracy. The hail referred to could well have been radioactive fallout or rock fragments thrown into the atmosphere by the explosion. The destruction was total. The city and every living thing in it simply ceased to exist in an instant. These records confirm that the catastrophe was not natural, but man-made. Someone or something struck with such force that it wiped a whole network of cities off the face of the earth, leaving behind only melted craters that later became lakes. However, official historical science preferred not to notice these inconvenient facts. Decades after the compilation of Remezov's maps, historian Gerhard Friedrich Miller was sent to Siberia. His mission lasted 10 years, and the goal was to write the correct history of the Russian state. Miller, traveling through the still-fresh ruins and communicating with surviving locals, tried to piece together the picture of what happened. The German scientist, possessing a rational European mind, faced an insurmountable problem. The facts spoke of one thing, but eyewitness accounts sounded like the ravings of a madman. When Miller asked the indigenous people, Siberian Slavs and representatives of other nations, who destroyed their prosperous country, they gave him an answer that he categorically could not accept. People told him that the world was destroyed by serpents. For the academician, this sounded like a children's fairy tale or a mythological allegory unworthy of serious scientific work. He could not even imagine that behind this strange word lay not a metaphor, but a direct indication of an external aggressor whose appearance was so alien to human perception that the consciousness of people of that time could only describe it through the image of a mythical monster. Miller wrote down these words but interpreted them in his own way, forever distorting the meaning of what was said and hiding the true reason for the fall of Great Tartary behind a screen of folklore. When historian Gerhard Friedrich Miller, traveling through the endless expanses of Siberia in the first half of the 18th century, asked local residents, descendants of a once great people, a direct question about the reasons for the death of their civilization, he expected to hear stories about plagues, famine, or invasions of nomads. However, the answer he received stunned him and was subsequently ruthlessly filtered out by official historiography as a ridiculous fairy tale. Old men who kept the memory of their ancestors stated with absolute seriousness that the world was destroyed by serpents. For an enlightened European mind, this sounded like mythological nonsense, but if we cast aside skepticism and try to analyze this statement through the prism of the paleo-contact theory, or lost technologies, a frightening truth opens up. The word serpent in the mouths of people living in the pre-industrial era could mean not a reptilian animal at all. Human consciousness is designed in such a way that when encountering something unknown, it tries to find the closest analogy from the familiar natural world. How would an 18th century eyewitness describe the flight of a modern cruise missile or warhead leaving a fiery trail and making a whistling sound? A long, cigar-shaped body flying across the sky and spewing fire would inevitably be associated with a serpent or a dragon. A fiery tail, smoke, a roar, all these attributes fit perfectly into the image of a mythical monster descending from the heavens to sow death. However, there is also a bolder interpretation, bordering on mysticism. Some researchers of esoteric currents and alternative history believe that serpents could imply very specific biological creatures not belonging to the human race. In ancient texts of many peoples, from India to South America, there are mentions of serpent-like gods or demons possessing incredible power and weapons of mass destruction. Perhaps legends about Lemurians or reptilians are not just fantasies, but memory distorted by millennia about a real encounter with another form of life. In this context, the famous Zmei Goronich from Russian fairy tales ceases to be just a folklore character. His 3 heads spewing flames could be an allegory for salvo fire, a wing of combat aircraft, or separating warheads of strategic weapons. Miller, faced with this evidence, found himself at a dead end. His task was to write a logical, understandable, and, most importantly, convenient history of the Russian Empire for the ruling dynasty. Neither nuclear wars, nor attacks by unknown races, nor giant flying objects fit into this narrative. The historian's consciousness simply refused to accept facts that destroyed the picture of the universe. Therefore, he acted as most academic scientists do in such situations. He rewrote what he heard, turning a real tragedy into an allegory. Serpents in his works turned into a metaphor for insidious enemies, pagans, or simply a figure of speech denoting evil. Thus, the true history of the genocide of the Tartary population was replaced by a safe fairy tale, which is now read to children at night, unsuspecting of its bloody origin. But if oral traditions and legends can be attributed to the wild imagination of illiterate peasants or translation errors, it is much more difficult to argue with physics. Words can lie, memory can fail, and paper will endure any corrections. But the earth itself does not know how to hide its wounds. There is material evidence that the serpents, whatever they were, rockets or creatures, left behind not only fear, but also a quite tangible, deadly trace. Deep in the Siberian taiga, there are places where even centuries later, instruments record anomalies that cannot be explained by any natural factors. And these exclusion zones keep a secret capable of overturning our understanding of reality. Among the endless and impassable expanses of the Irkutsk region lies one of the most mysterious geological anomalies on the planet, which baffles official science and serves as a silent witness to events that are not written about in textbooks. We are talking about the famous Potomsky crater, which local hunters have long called the Fire Eagle's Nest. This giant cone-shaped formation of crushed limestone towers over the taiga like a monument to an unknown force. For a long time, it was believed that this was a trace from a meteorite fall, or perhaps a unique type of not fully formed volcano. However, thorough expeditions and laboratory studies of recent years have brought results that force a reconsideration of the entire history of the development of Siberia. Scientists investigating the zone around the crater took samples of larchwood growing on the slopes and at the foot of this formation. Since larch is a long-lived tree, some specimens have preserved in their tree rings a chronicle of the climate and the state of the atmosphere for several centuries. Analysis of these wooden archives showed a shocking picture. In the middle of the 19th century, specifically starting from the 1860s, a sharp and inexplicable spike in the content of radioactive elements is recorded in the wood. We are talking about such serious isotopes as uranium and strontium. The concentration of these substances exceeds background values by several times, and this period of anomalous radioactive contamination lasted about 10 years, after which the indicators began to slowly decline. This discovery completely destroys the version of the natural origin of the crater or the fall of an ordinary stone meteorite. Neither volcanic activity nor space rocks caused such a burst of radiation, characteristic of nuclear decay. The presence of strontium and uranium in the tree rings of that period is direct material evidence that in the 19th century an event occurred in the deep taiga associated with the release of colossal energy and radioactive substances. This essentially confirms the hypothesis that Siberia was subjected to bombardment by high-tech weapons, the operating principle of which resembled modern thermonuclear charges. Skeptics and representatives of academic science still cannot give a single intelligible theory explaining this phenomenon. They try to attribute everything to rare geological processes, but physics is inexorable. Uranium and strontium do not appear out of nowhere in such quantities just like that. The Potomsky crater is not just a geological curiosity. It is a scar on the body of the Earth left by the very weapon that in folk legends took the form of serpents or balls of fire. This is a place where the secret becomes clear, where myths about the death of Great Tartary take on flesh and blood in the form of an isotopic trace. Thus we come to a dismal but inevitable conclusion. The official version of history taught to us from school days is just a skillfully created screen. Behind the dates of the reign of emperors, descriptions of palace coups, and the natural development of allegedly empty lands lies a tragedy of planetary scale. The death of the Tartary civilization was not a process of decline or internal degradation. It was a targeted destruction, a genocide carried out using technologies surpassing everything we know about the 19th century. External intervention, whether it be another race, a highly developed hostile civilization, or another force, wiped cities and peoples off the face of the earth, leaving us only fragments of truth and radioactive ash on which a new forest grew. We live on the ruins of a great past without even suspecting it. We have only slightly lifted the veil of secrecy, but the picture of the past is much more complex and larger than it might seem at first glance. Right now, 2 videos have appeared on your screen that will further overturn your view of real history and supplement the facts we discussed today. Be sure to watch them to piece together this complex puzzle and learn what historians are silent about. See you soon!